Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good to see a good attendance this late in the day. But I'm delighted to present a panel on MIFID, the FCA, Brexit, etc. So we've got a lot to get through. So delighted that Mark, Jude, and Barney can join us and share their insights into these complex areas. So if we start with MIFID II, basically we have 48 days to go until the day of the TRIFID. And believe me, the sort of extent of this legislation is something that we've not seen in a long, long time, and it reaches into all parts of the markets. We're going to cover two parts of it, one of which is reporting. I'm sure everyone saw the Merrill Lynch fine. There's nothing like a good eye-watering fine to concentrate the mind on the subject. But equally, we've covered earlier in the day how the global code covers both buy-side, sell-side, venues, and impacts on the retail industry with the retail brokers. And indeed, MIFID II has the same effect. So with MIFID II governing the client relationship, for a retail broker, what are the biggest concerns in the run-up? And here, I suspect we're delving into the murky world of allied regulation as well. PRIPS Kids, I think, is one that's probably relevant here. So Jude, perhaps if you could kick us off with a quick view of how we're seeing it in terms of product governance, conduct of business rules, and inducements.
Thank you, David. So, yeah, I think my view is MIFID II is going to bring quite a number of challenges to the CFD industry. I mean, well, to the investment world as a whole. But I think there's some particular headlines for CFD firms and really around the investor protection suite. So one of the first areas is product governance. From January the 3rd, firms are going to be required to put in place product governance policies that will include assessing what their target market is, and that's not just jurisdictional market, that is customer type, risk appetite, levels of experience, appetite for loss. That's going to have to be very clearly documented. The firm's going to have to design their distribution channels and distribution policies around to reach their target markets, and then they're going to have to assess whether or not, in fact, they're actually reaching those target markets. So that's quite a bit of work for firms, you know, to take on board the documentation exercise, but also it's going to provide the regulator with a roadmap actually to look at the type of customers the firm is designing their products, i.e. CFDs, for, and the type of customers they're actually attaining, and whether those customers are actually meeting, the products are meeting the needs of that consumer group. So I think that gives the FCA quite a lot of, or the national competent authorities, because obviously it would be the same for any EU jurisdiction, a lot to look at. That ties in with some work that every firm from January the 3rd, for every product that they sell, they're going to have to produce a 3-page key information document. It's designed to be short and readable, but actually it's not really designed for the CFD market. It's going to be quite granular in terms of the risks that are required. The risk level, which will, for a CFD, will be risk level 7. And then the firm is going to have to show scenarios of loss based on VAR calculations to show what the outcomes might be for that CFD.
Right, and I suppose with the news out of Poland, the finance magnates broke the other day with XTB being under investigation and the allied concerns around binary options. In what way do you think that this is actually going to change the way that a retail broker operates in the market?
Well, I think it's going to have to move. The regulatory focus is going to move into what are the products that firms are selling. Are they actually designed for a target market? Is the target market suitable for that product? The corollary of that is if the regulator decides it's not, they have product intervention powers. they'll be able to intervene. They'll be able to stop firms selling either to a particular set of customers, a particular type of product, and they can also potentially order restitution to customers where they feel they've been missold. So actually, along with the requirement to document comes quite extensive powers.
Right. And moving on to the reporting side, Mark, we were discussing literally just before the panel about the confusion over trading on a trading venue, i.e. what does need to be reported, what doesn't need to be reported. How are you seeing that sort of from the big picture point of view?
I mean, my mind boggles at some of the non-reporting aspects of MiFID II that Jude's just outlined. Fortunately, I'm able to blink in my approaches, and with next regulatory reporting, I just focus on the transaction reporting, trade publication aspects. For retail derivatives firms, there's good and bad news. The good news is not all of your products are transaction reportable. You know, rough rule of thumb is all of your FX is out. All of your equities, whether single stocks or index-based, are in, and commodities will be split down the middle, depending on whether you base them on an EU commodities contract or a non-EU contract. So that's the simplifying side. On the complicating side, you now, for all of your retail clients, have to get a national identifier, and it's not one size fits all. You can't just go for passport number or concatenate their name and date of birth. It depends on their nationality. So you've first got to, by January, get hold of what's their nationality, what's the appropriate identifier, and get hold of it. So national insurance number for UK firms, passport for anyone outside of the EU. And if you have any institutional clients outside of the EU, your big battle is going to get them to get LEIs. Because the instructions from the FCA certainly have been very clear that if you have a client with positions, an institutional client who hasn't supplied you with an LEI, you're going to have to close down his positions before the 3rd of January. And the reason for having to do that is that if you left it and then they wanted to close out in the middle of March, you wouldn't be able to make a compliant report because you wouldn't have the LEI to use for that. So they're being very stringent about this collection of national identifiers for individuals, LEIs for all counterparties that you trade with. So they're the kind of hurdles that you're going to have to overcome.
So sort of looking at the practicalities of that, that's quite difficult because most firms will have probably got a scan of a passport when they went through their KYC periods, but they're unlikely to have this in a digitized format. So are they literally going to have to just pull all of those paper records, employ some people, and start inputting the data in digitized format afresh?
Yeah, I mean, even if you've taken the passport of everyone across your whole client base for AML purposes or KYC, you'll find that you have someone where a different priority identifier has been established. So you're going to have to go and get their, I don't know, their Maltese personal identification number from their identity card. The passport alone won't be sufficient. What you've got to do is actually to retrieve documents that back up what they're saying. So it's not enough for them to give you a passport number. They have to send you a scan of the passport, or in the case of a UK national, you've got to send something that proves your national insurance number. So what are you going to choose, your pay slip or your tax return? One of those would have to be supplied to be able to back that up.
So one of the aspects of the LEI is so that, say, for instance, it really came to our attention post-Lehman, where people seemed to be uncertain to exactly who they traded with, and that became obviously a regulatory concern. But just thinking of, I mean, I changed my passport number then changes. So with the LEI, we're going to have a permanent LEI for that legal entity forever. But if your passport number changes, you're going to get a change in this. So you're going to have to monitor it and refresh it and keep going.
Yeah, that was the initial idea, but that's been revised in guidance. So you have to establish a one-time verification of the identity using the LEI or the national identifier. But ESMA has clarified that you don't have to monitor. They know that passports expire. You establish the person's identity and you can carry on using that identifier. The same with LEIs. LEIs lapse if you don't maintain them. You are allowed to report a lapsed LEI as your client. Reporting firms have to keep their LEIs up to date, but for your counterparties, they just need to get it on a one-off basis.
Okay, well, at least that's some comfort. Perhaps they do listen to us from time to time. Jude, we're running out of time now. Are you seeing a big panic in the industry trying to get all this stuff together?
Short answer is yes. I think many firms are dreadfully unprepared for MiFID II. Nobody wants to be the first mover. Certainly, I know there's been a lot of toing and froing, even with some of the big firms, on what their kit is going to look like. How many assets are they going to have? One per product? Are they going to have one per asset class? What is the recommended holding period for a CFD? You know, we've got algo traders who might hold it for a number of milliseconds, and then we've got the position traders who might hold it for months. So, and all of these need to be articulated and informed. So yes, we haven't even talked about inducements yet, which is another significant area of impact for the CFD industry. You know, from January the 3rd, any payments you make to third parties are going to, they're banned for advisors and portfolio managers, and any other payments have to be designed to improve the service to the client, which I think in an IB model is a very difficult call really to make. So I think, yes, people are definitely behind the curve. FCA have said that they will exercise a degree of regulatory forbearance. So I think that means they won't come out hunting people for the first 3 months. But that's on the basis that firms have clear plans and are making clear efforts to implement. But I think after Q1, I think all bets are off really.
Yes, there's been a lot of talk about a small honeymoon period in spite of the 1-year delay to the major legislation anywhere. And I think the FCA certainly here has made clear that that is their intention, as long as people aren't using it to either not do something or sort of in some way trying to build in extra time. They need to have a proper project, etc. But Mark, we hear it very differently, I think, in the reporting world, where it really is that the reports have to be there day one and accurate.
Well, I think there's been, for transaction reporting, we can say that there's been a lot of guidance over the last couple of years. They've had XML examples out there of how things were supposed to be reported, and we've had this 1 year's delay. So the indications are that the FCA will be very focused on the T+1 transaction reporting. So I don't think there'll be much of a honeymoon period. I think they'll expect people pretty much to get that right from day one. On the trade publication side, that is the T+0 publication of anything that needs to be notified to the market, there's been much less guidance. There's a far less clear idea of whose responsibility this is and how it's going to work in practice, because there's a lot of things need to pass around between members of the market so that you know, for example, are you dealing with a systematic internalizer, in which case you can expect them to do the publication, or are they just acting as a MiFID investment firm, in which case you might have to do the reporting. So I think a high standard will be set for the transaction reporting, the T+1, and it's kind of wait and see how it works for the trade publication.
Right. Moving on, we've also got the impact of MiFID II sort of on some of the operating models, so particularly the A and B book model that's often deployed by a retail broker. How do we actually see that changing in terms of the MiFID II regulation in specific?
Well, I think one of the things that actually has slipped past a lot of people's attention is that in drafting MiFID II, one of the things I think that happened was that all the tweaks and nuances that maybe the regulators or the European authorities thought should have been in MiFID I have been added to MiFID II. And one of those is a redefinition of matched principle. A matched principle under MiFID II carries a newer, cleaner definition or more precise definition of a firm that enters, a facilitator that enters into equal and opposite transactions without taking a profit or loss and only taking a disclosed commission. Obviously, in a markup model, that doesn't work unless you're disclosing your markup. So I think that is potentially a significant issue for matched principle firms, obviously less so for full dealers. But I think that's one that's flown under everybody's radar, really.
Yeah, no, it is certainly one that has been, sort of at the global code level looked at. And indeed, the announcement overnight is that there's going to be a particular look at the cover and deal type transaction and whether that becomes an agent. And with MiFID II, of course, we have the problem with an agent being that an agent can't have market risk or settlement risk. And yet in the foreign exchange market, we're much more towards this match principle and that type of area. Barney, have you got any thoughts on this from the legal side?
Not that you've not mentioned, no.
Oh, okay. So, well, we have also got the subject of Brexit here, and, perhaps how things can change post-Brexit. So with Brexit, I always think as an Englishman, sort of going abroad, you've always been sort of having those jokes about the English always want their eggs very softly boiled and continental hotels can only produce them hard-boiled. With Brexit, we seem to be shifting very much towards a hard Brexit now. This could have some very profound implications on financial services in the UK. And perhaps sort of starting from my left, have you got any thoughts, Mark, that you've been hearing on the Brexit side?
Well, my only thoughts, and apologies that I'm focused on regulatory reporting, my thoughts are that MiFID II is essentially exactly what the FCA wants. They wrote a lot of MiFID II. So I would imagine that any post-Brexit reporting solution will really pretty much follow those lines. There won't be much change in the way that reporting gets approached. EMEA, on the other hand, I think was decided centrally and was imposed across Europe and goes very much beyond the minimum that is necessary to meet the G20 requirements. So I think there's some significant scope for EMEA to be rewritten post-Brexit. But MiFID II, I think we're going to get pretty much what is in place January the 3rd.
Yeah, no, we certainly do hear that the UK will be sort of super equivalent come the sort of March 2019, and it's thereafter that we could see maybe some changes that are sensible and well thought out. Of course, the other question is that if we're out, what does equivalence mean the other way? Do we expect Europe to have the equivalent of the senior managers and certification regime, et cetera, et cetera? And that one, I think, is always an unanswered question. But Jude, have you seen any comments around Brexit specifically affecting this area?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the biggest issue is whether or not we're going to retain our passporting rights. A lot of people, I mean, I do regulatory authorizations. A lot of people have come to the UK with a view, they like the UK, skilled workforce, the centre of FX, etc. But also with a view to passporting into mainland Europe and choosing the UK as their base and their home. That potentially is going to change if we lose the passporting rights and even the equivalence. Unfortunately, even if we are deemed to be equivalent, that under the way that MiFID's written, that only allows us to do business with professional customers. So potentially, we do run the risk of losing the rights. If in a hard Brexit scenario, we lose the risk that we will lose the right to passport our services to retail clients. So I think everybody needs to be doing a bit of Brexit planning. Obviously, we'd like to think that the outcome will be much better than that. whether we have a 2-year moratorium, an extension of those rights, or whether actually the UK at the last minute manages to seal a deal. That would be great. But there is one other little corollary to that, which is that what you were saying, Mark, about the FCA really authoring a lot of MiFID II. The byproduct of Brexit has been that FCA, whereas it always, I think, led negotiations at EU level and had a huge influence at ESMA, we've lost that, really. I don't think anybody in Europe is particularly interested in what the UK has to say because we've announced we're leaving the party. And given that we are the biggest exporter of financial services, and particularly, I mean, we're, the CFD audience, I think, apart from Cyprus, we massive export to the EU. What that means is that our voice has been lost at European level. Our voice has been lost at ESMA. ESMA have already said they're likely to intervene, use their product intervention powers on the CFD. They're looking at all the proposals put forward by regulators. They're looking at BaFin's proposal for no negative balance. They're looking at FCA's leverage proposals. They're looking at the marketing restrictions that have been put in place by some European countries like France and Belgium. And without the UK voice there to temper that on behalf of our industry, where we're the biggest provider, I do have concerns about what ESMA's going to conclude.
Right. I am happy to take questions from the floor as we go along. So if anyone does have one, if you could try and attract my attention, and we'll get a mic to you. But Barney, I think this really does tee you up to give us the A to Z of Brexit.
Well, I just on the post-Brexit regulatory environment, in the case of a no deal, even though we came up with some of this stuff, which I agree, I would hope and I believe the UK will be amenable to a rethink. So I think, the idea that we sit here and become an EU light, I don't think is likely. Either we'll get a deal, or we'll go our own way, and obviously that will involve tax and regulatory changes of some sort. In terms of the deal, I mean, it is possible to enhance the equivalence regime and replicate the passport. And I've published a sort of template, a fully worked out regulation that would do just that with a bilateral agreement. So it's possible to get back to where we are now. Will the EU do it? I think it's quite likely they will for wholesale. For retail, that's a tricky subject anyway, because in fact, all sorts of local law issues arise for retail, not least, enforcement of judgments, consumer protection issues, and so on, that make it trickier. I don't rule it out, and it's in the proposal that I mentioned, but it may or may not be granted. And if, by the way, they don't grant a deal for retail, then of course we're in a position I mentioned, which is that you're in a no-deal situation where the UK can enhance its attractiveness and should do so in other ways. Now, how do you do business with people in FX, cross-border into Europe, and vice versa, in the institutional and retail space, particularly where it's regulated, which is really the main thing we're talking about here? The answer is you're going to have to come up with constructs that make the regulated activity domestic where possible, so as to avoid triggering the EU perimeter. So, for instance, someone could have a business of setting up a trust for EU customers, which holds the benefit of contracts that the trust enters into under their instruction for people in the EU, which, as a matter of legal construct, means that the regulated activity takes place, at least the trade takes place in London between yourselves and the trust. So that's one idea. Another, obviously, is setting up little corporates or giving people sort of alphabet stock in corporates where they can get, again, the benefit of a contract entered into purely within the UK regulatory jurisdiction. These sorts of concepts, by the way, are consistent with how international regulation works, not just EU regulation, where the regulation looks at the activity, so certain activities, where they take place. So the trick is to make those activities domestic. So really, I think, if we're in a no deal scenario, we're going to have to be on our mettle in looking out for those sorts of techniques. There are various others, and I've published a book with some of them. And there are others that, we're developing all the time to try and avoid triggering cross-border issues. They're more hassle for your customer base in the EU, there's no question. The question, it's really down to economic incentives. You're going to have to sort of help them buy the product through these techniques and show them some upside, I suppose, or at least neutralize the cost. And therefore, the UK is going to have to take steps to offset some of the cost for you. So I think it's quite a complicated sequence of events that needs to take place. There's a number of things have to happen at once to basically keep all the business, and I think it's possible to do that, here.
I mean, we've seen a lot of global initiatives, sort of codes of conduct is one example, but equally on the regulatory stage, a lot of regulation moving more towards a principle-based model, a more international model. Regulators seem to communicate with each other a lot better. And I did notice that there is an international agreement on services which includes financial services called the Trade in Services Agreement. I was quite surprised to find that it was on its 21st round in November 2016, which was actually organised and chaired by the EU, which reported that talks are progressing well and parties made good progress in working towards an agreed text. Do you think this could be an indication that perhaps our fear in financial services about the outcome of Brexit could be a little bit over-exaggerated?
Yeah, I mean, just 2 points there. On the style of regulation being more principles-based, the US is moving towards a more principles-based environment. The UK historically has rightly had a much more principles, or it became outcomes-based environment, and I think we're going to go back to that. So high standards, fewer rules. It's not the EU method, so I don't see the EU doing that in a hurry. And the reason for that is not, well, it's partly philosophical, but it's largely to do with the fact that rulemaking is federal and supervision is local in the EU. And so as a matter of exercise of power and in order to try and get consistency across the EU, the only lever they have to do that is by writing more rules and ironing out local discretion. So on that point, I think the convergence will take a while, because in order to get to that within the EU and make it truly global, what you'd have to have happen in the EU is the supervisors have to be given federal authority, which the French are angling for, with ESMA being made into a sort of grand SEC, at which point you could remove a lot of the rules. But I think that's quite a way away. On the on the other issue about whether or not there's some sort of global trade and services arrangement that we agreed, I absolutely believe that's the direction of travel. I mean, the WTO isn't that old, and it was a huge achievement for goods. And clearly there is a big push for services, but I think it's a way off. I mean, if you look within the EU itself, there isn't that much services harmonization apart from in financial services. I mean, for lawyers and accountants, auditors, and so on, there isn't really a services regime. So I think I think it's a way off. But having said that, these things can come around more quickly than maybe 10, 15, 20 years, which in the scheme of things is not that far away for all of our careers, of course. However, I think we need to be looking at these more short-term solutions, which involve us sort of basically taking some imaginative steps to make sure it doesn't really matter. We've got to neutralize this stuff for the period between now and when it becomes more global.
Right. Jude.
I was just going to jump in there and say that, if anybody in the audience has read any of the EU regulatory technical standards that are just gushing out of Europe, I think they would understand that we're a long way from principles-based regulation in the EU. And I'm a bit of a cynic, I have to admit. I think that whilst the sort of the global mechanism for trading may well be, framework may well be putting in place, I do think that's for the professionals market. I don't personally think that's aimed at retail. So I think if we're talking probably to a retail brokerage audience here, I'm not so sure that's going to apply, certainly not in the short term.
Yeah, I was just going to say there are some aspects of we have to wait and see but within next regulatory reporting, we've taken the view of hope for the best, prepare for the worst. So when we applied for a trade repository license in our own right, we've established that in Stockholm, just to be on the safe side. In Stockholm.
My wife's Swedish. Good choice.
Just on retail, the biggest selling point, I think, well, there's a number of selling points, but one huge selling point for London sort of products and sales from London is our legal system and court system. Because I think, you know, in honesty, if you look across Europe, there are a lot of court systems that will protect their retail customers, you know, almost regardless of the letter of the law, which is why it's been so difficult to create a retail passport. Our courts are extremely fair. When there is mis-selling, they will make an award regardless of the nationality of the claimant, which is a big selling point. Conversely, against people here, conversely, if there is no valid claim, they won't. And it's the politicization of retail court judgments that I think has been, in reality, underpinning, and it's not much talked about, the biggest obstacle, which remains, in fact, to the retail passport in financial services. And I don't see that going away in a hurry, because basically the courts of many countries are sort of see themselves almost as a semi-political protector of their own consumer base. And we're very unusual in not having that. I can't think of any other court system in the world which takes a dispassionate view of the rights and wrongs of the situation.
And we did have stalking the market, the financial transaction tax, with at least 11 countries, I believe it now might be 10, pushing ahead with that. And obviously, looking at the first construct of that financial transaction tax, one of the areas that would be very hard hit was FX, just solely because of the calculation of the quantum of the tax. When you translate that back to the spread between the bid and the offer, had quite a traumatic effect. Do you think that the threat of Brexit now will have killed that completely dead?
Well, not. Well, depending on what happens with the transitional period. I don't know how many people in this audience are likely to be from large institutions, but at the moment we're in a very dangerous position. The UK is in a dangerous position for Brexit purposes, because the large institutions have a chain of logic which basically runs along the following lines. It says there's a cliff edge, which I disagree with, but there is a legal cliff edge, it is alleged, on Brexit. And it is impossible to do business into the EU after Brexit without a deal. Therefore, and from March 2019, you're going to have to start. 2018, you have to take steps to move bits of business in order to keep things going, unless you know there's going to be a deal. And you have to have a transitional known by then, otherwise you'll start triggering those plans. That's the chain of logic, and the government is responding to that. But what looks likely to happen is the government, if it goes down, follows through on this, because of Theresa May's political statement that we've got to leave the EU in March 2019, the transitional period that the UK purchases for whatever price will be one where the UK is a rule taker for 2 years. And there will be nothing to prevent the EU, I mean, you know, apart from goodwill, which I would hope is there, but there'll be nothing technical to prevent the EU from A, levying the transaction tax during that period, B, requiring the UK to help collect it. It could do the same, you know, it could impose Euro clearing requirements as well. So in terms of location policy. So essentially the UK would be chained to a chair for 2 or whatever it is years during this transitional period, all because of this logic that there is a cliff edge and you've got to have a transition. I'm not convinced that logic's correct. It may now be too late to convince institutions to rethink on that, because I think if you look at UK making tax adjustments to make it, for instance, tax-free for 5 years, doing EU-facing business for anyone affecting it in a case of a no deal, I think our leverage would be better. I think you get a better deal, and I think you get a quicker deal. So the troubling situation we're in all starts from that premise, and we've just published something explaining why in law we don't think for most products, and that would include FX, there isn't a cliff edge, because actually international law comes in, including the EU's own Charter of Fundamental Rights, to prevent contracts already in existence before Brexit from being performed in accordance with their full terms, including embedded options and every single possible detail and glory after Brexit. So I think, flipping the problem on its head, if the industry took a more robust view of the law, which is in black and white, and there are lots of eminent people prepared to stand behind this as well, if they took a robust view of the law, you could basically have emails with your clients before Brexit, making clear you want to take advantage of this. You could add to your client base, go around the EU, adding in all sorts of people you might wish to deal with over the next 2 years, and that would then take the heat out of needing a transitional and anyone thinking about moving anything, at which point it's a normal negotiation of, okay, show me the trade deal and I'll decide what to pay you, rather than this thing where it's a sort of a ransom payment for an uncertain outcome, which is where we are at the moment.
Yes, I certainly see that. Jude or Mark, do you have any views on that area, or?
Again, I think it depends on what is your marketplace. Is it the interprofessionals market, or again, is it a retail focus? I'm not sure whether that is going to work in a retail business that's possibly looking for customers. It wouldn't be able to, maybe doesn't have that sort of longevity, let's say, of relationship or weight of relationship. Let's face it, the retail business is predicated upon large numbers of customers trading for maybe not extended periods of time.
I mean, how difficult is it to sort of just establish a European beachhead if you are fearing it in the short term? I mean, Cyprus, Malta seem to be very popular with the retail market. Is it a particularly costly exercise, or one that can be borne?
Well, so the interesting thing about that is that what's happened is that whereas there was a number of jurisdictions that were quite FX friendly, the doors have been slamming one by one. I think Malta's pretty much closed the door on you. They're not interested in UFX business. Cyprus is still open for business. Ireland, forget it. France, Belgium, Germany is still open for business if you're happy to meet BaFin's requirements, which are arguably more stringent than those in Cyprus. Yes, it is doable. I have to, if clients ask me, I have to say, I think if you need to prepare, I do feel that. It's a bit like if you go out without an umbrella, it's going to rain, isn't it? So if you have an umbrella with you, it might not, but it's that logic that, bearing in mind it's going to take up to a year to get a new operation established, regulatory licensing, locate directors, locate premises, given that ESMA has warned all of the national competent authorities a few months ago to watch out for UK firms. I mean, they're very, very quite bold language. I think they call them letterbox entities. Watch out for letterbox entities coming from the UK, trying to set up in your jurisdiction. They have to have a proper footprint. So the different regulators have all been told by their mother regulator, ESMA, to watch out for the Brexit. So actually, the idea of going there, one man and his dog, probably not going to work. So I think, yes, it's doable. There's very few places that are open, that have their doors open for the CFD industry, or have the qualified staff, for instance, to service the FX industry. And the requirements, the footprint is definitely got to be heavier than maybe it was a couple of years ago.
I think that the UK, probably together with Cyprus, has a better understanding. The regulator has a better understanding of the CFD, the retail derivatives industry, than most of the other regulators, and certainly better than ESMA. So I'm hoping that that kind of knowledge and experience will be able to be kept in place after Brexit, and that some mechanism will be devised to enable the selling of retail services into mainland Europe from here.
Well, I mean, certainly sort of Europe does around about 75% of its business in London. So it's a two-way discussion, I think. I don't think it is just that it's bad news for the UK and good news for Europe. And it's interesting to see the head of the French regulatory authority today opining that he doesn't feel that euro clearing needs to be moved out of London. And I think that that is taking a pragmatic view that if it was forced out, it actually could work more to the harm of Europe than to the harm of the UK. And so if we are going to get a sort of more pragmatic Europe negotiating, hopefully once this little political song and dance finishes towards the end of this year, are we hopeful that we're going to get a good outcome? And we are right down on to our last minute, so we'll keep it brief from the panel. And in the meantime, if anyone has anything from the floor, do just let me know, and I'll get you included in the last dying embers of the discussion.
So I think we will get a good outcome, and what you've just mentioned in terms of the French regulator saying they don't want euro clearing is a massive shift from the official French position, and they speak with one voice on this, of only 3 or 4 months ago. You know, and Christian Noyer, the ex-governor of the Banque de France, has been around London advocating this, you know, and met many of us over the last year. So that is a massive thing. And what it shows is that the arguments being put forth are reasonable, and that they're being listened to, and that we are dealing with reasonable people on the other side of the table as well. So I think it's very promising, you know, and it's very easy if we're all talking to each other to build it up as an impossible situation where it's going to be calamitous. But actually, it's little things like this. I mean, not little. It's little anecdotal points like this, which indicate to me that this isn't the calamity that some people painted as being.
Final word from you, Mark?
Well, I think that I think we are going to get a good outcome, but I think it's needed the bleak prospect of a cliff edge or a no deal exit to actually bring some pragmatism to bear on the European side to what has to move and what has to be offered and accepted to let a deal happen.
And Jude, you're...
Well, I'm a compliance guy, so I'm a bit of a cynic. No, actually, I think, again, I have that separation between what's going to happen to the professional business or the institutional business and what's going to happen to retail. I'm not so convinced that we're just going to be handed a passport. I think the EU should and has been insisting that you don't get one freedom and not get the other 3. You get the 4 freedoms or you get no freedoms. And I think that is in respect of retail financial services. So I'm a seller on the retail. I'm a buyer on the rest.
Oh, well, has anybody got anything from the audience just before I bring us to a close? No? Well, just for me to say a huge thank you to the panel. Personally, unlike my eggs, I prefer my Brexit hard. I think it's a better negotiating position. Just that I'm not expecting a dollop of caviar on top of the hard-boiled egg. But with that, can you please show your appreciation for a wonderful panel who've been very informative?